Kev Baker Show. Fighting for humanity and against globalism. One mind at a time. It's the Freedom Link with Joe Joseph.
Welcome, everybody, to the Freedom Link this 8th day of August 2014, hour number 2 of 3 of Freaky Friday. Your transatlantic truth right here on Truth Frequency Radio, truthfrequencyradio.com. We're trying to get a hold of Dr. Agnew right now, so he'll be here momentarily.
Oh, Joe, that sounded almost pessimistic. He is coming on. We have spoke to the great man. He's just connecting to Skype as we speak, folks.
Okay, so anyway, as I try to do that, let's kind of recap what we went over in hour number 1 of Transatlantic Truth. First of all, they flew the Palestinian flag over, what was it? What Scottish building was that? Well,
it's Glasgow City Chambers, but it's not just Glasgow. Dunbartonshire Council, also in Scotland, have followed. So, well, they actually done it first. They were the first to fly the flag.
Wow. Outstanding. We're, there we go. Dr. Agnew, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hot diggity. So we got Dr. Agnew here, which is good, Kev, because
it's a pleasure to actually finally get to speak to you.
Host of X Squared Radio and a man of many endeavors. It is awesome to now everything's going crazy. It's awesome
nice
to have you here.
Get some intelligence on the show, Joe.
We're actually going to have some intelligence. Somebody talking that actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to physics.
Qualified woo.
Yes. It's good to have you here, Dr. Agnew.
Well, it's good to be here. It's been a crazy, crazy Friday. Wow. I've worked probably just under 100 hours in the last 7 days, so it's kind of...
Is that all? Jeez.
I know, I'm cutting back.
Hey, how's the car company going?
It's going really well. We had the governor and the mayor and the deputy director of the EPA out to the plant yesterday, and they really liked the truck, and things are coming along really nicely.
Wow, that's awesome. And, of course, you're talking about the Everest, right?
Actually, the 2015 model is called the Condor.
Really? Oh, even better. That's awesome. And so what makes the electric car that you're putting out better than, say, the Tesla or anything else? What would you say is its big perks or advantages?
Well, that's a two-part question. It's better than the Tesla because it's affordable.
Very good.
Better than everything else because it is the only electric pickup truck on the market.
Well, I guess that does it. When you got the market cornered, you got the market cornered. That's good.
If you're a truck guy, then it's better than everything else.
And being from North Carolina, I'm a truck guy.
There you go.
So that's great. So what we're talking about tonight, of course, I got Kev Baker from the Kev Baker Show, Kenneth Webb, Change of Channel, and also Johnny Sinclair, or Whistles, and Marty. And we're talking about, first, where do you want to go, Kev? What do you want to start off with?
Well, you finished up the first half of the show with kind of biblical prophecy, biblical times, and then we got into that Grail relic, and I was hinting at the ancient technology that may not have been around at that time, and how arguably, I think anyway, it probably surpasses what we class as our greatest technology today. It's just we don't understand it.
Well, Doc, what do you think? Do you think that the ancients possessed technology that exceeded our own?
Well, here's what I can tell you from my personal experience. I went to Tibet in 2007. It was one of the last years that anyone from the West could go to Tibet. It's closed since 2008 to Westerners because China has occupied Tibet since, I think, 1959. So you're going to take the government tour, right, which is basically what we did, but we had a very small group. And I'm kind of known for getting in places that you're not supposed to go, but with permission, just because I don't know why it happens, but it does. So we're at the Potala, which is up until 100 years ago the tallest building in the world, at about 11,500 feet elevation. We were spending a few days there. So we took the government-approved white box tour up on the roof area and the basic open areas. And there's a set of double doors that obviously leads into, more private, deeper places in the Patala that has a chain around the two panic bars on the front of it. And there's a Chinese guard standing there with a rifle. Who knows if it has any ammo in it, but he's standing there anyway. So I asked my guide, who speaks both Tibetan and Chinese, ask the guy if he will let you and I go behind the door and just explore. And he said, well, I have been giving this tour for like 7 years, and I ask every time I come, and they always say no, but I'll go ahead and ask. So he asked, and the guard shook his head no. And we just turned around and started not really walking. We were more like sashaying. We weren't really going fast. And all of a sudden, there was a tap on our shoulder, and it was the guard. And he motioned for us. And he led us to the door, and he unlocked the door and let us in. And at that moment, there were two pilgrims that happened to be right there by us. And I guess there's a custom that if you're at the right place at the right time and the door opens, you're supposed to be there. So the two pilgrims went in with us. So there were four of us. He let us in, closed the door behind us, and he basically told my guy, just knock on the door when you want to come out. No one had saw us go in. There was nobody else on the floor, just us four. So we went in, and it was not pitch black, but it was really dark. No lighting in this place at all. We walked forward about, 30 feet, 40 feet, and came to a staircase that went down into the lower parts. So we went down about 5 flights of stairs on a rickety wooden staircase all the way to the stone ground floor. And when I stepped out on the floor, there was this huge, like 8 foot in diameter swastika. It etched in the red stone that we were standing on. In the middle of it, there was a big piece of turquoise. And I said, wow, my guide's name was Punsala. And I said, Punsala, what is a swastika doing down here? He said, well, that's not a swastika. That's what you call it, in the 20th century. But that was carved in the 7th century. And it represents the Milky Way galaxy. So it's kind of odd that they would know that the Milky Way galaxy was a spiral galaxy laid out like that. And then our eyes kind of got used to the light, and I noticed that there were these really, really heavy, like 1 inch thick drapes hanging on this long wall over a window. And so I moved the drapes back to kind of let a little light in, just kind of held them back, didn't, slide them on the curtain rod or anything, because they're really tall, probably 16, maybe 18 feet high. And what was shown in the light before us was a structure that was about 40 feet tall. And I said, what is that? And Punsala said, it's a stupa. Only this one was made of what we estimate to be about 4,000 pounds of gold.
Wow.
And it had about 10,000 gems on it. And I said, I'm going to take a picture of this. So I did. And I said, so what is it supposed to do? He said, well, the Panchen Lamas, which I guess are one rank underneath a Dalai Lama, they sit in this thing and they meditate, and it transports them. It opens stargates for them. And they actually bury the Panchen Lamas. They intern them in the center of the stupa to help their souls, move out into heaven. And sure enough, up on the ceiling is a 4-dimensional stargate centered right over this thing. And then I said, well, is this some kind of religious thing, or is this technology? Because this really resembles a Tesla coil. I said, look here. See the small coils at the top, and it comes down to large coils at the bottom, and there's a reflecting dish at the top. And look at these these wings coming out from the top going down, and the ribbons wrapped around it. That represents electricity, like lightning.
Yeah.
These people saw this work, and they duplicated it as a sort of a symbol of being able to transport themselves through portals to other parts of the universe. And when I got back, I took my photograph and I overlaid it over a Tesla coil, and it matched. So it's clear that Nikola Tesla saw this in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And the Tibetans saw it in the 7th century, and they built the same thing, just with different capabilities.
Wow.
Would that not explain as well the Nazi interest in getting to that neck of the woods, Joe?
I would think it would. I mean, they were big into getting all the ancient artifacts, weren't they, Dr. Agnew?
They were, but they didn't get this one. They had looted throughout Tibet. They had looted, but they didn't get to this one. It was like way in the basement rock bottom of the Patala. And as far as I know, and I know a lot of people that have been to Tibet, although that community is pretty small, and no one got a picture of this. I think it's the only picture in the West of this structure.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. But it's just another validation, that this technology existed a long time ago. And it makes me wonder, Doc, that, did the ancients possess, again, that technology that just kind of dwarfed ours? If you look at the Bible, Matthew 24:37 was, as was in the days of Noah, so will be in so as it will be in the coming of the Son of Man. So, what they're saying is, according to the Bible, is like as was in the days of Noah, that technology was there. That
I think maybe you're right, but I think from what I saw, this was a depiction of that technology. You're right, that technology was there, was being used, but not by them. They saw it, they copied it, they mimicked it with the level of ability that they had in that day. Now, Tesla was a lot more advanced.
Right.
Was able to actually make it fire up. But these people understood the principle.
Now, do you think Tesla had any access to that kind of information, or was it something that he just kind of concocted on his own?
That's a really good question. According to Tesla's writings, what I've been able to dig up on it, he had the vision for his step-up coil in a dream. So the idea that he traveled to Tibet in the 19th century and saw this structure is pretty slim. I think it would have been robbed if Europeans had been coming down there. They would have cut this thing up and carted it off to Europe.
Wow. Yeah.
Now,
So,
Dr. Agnew, you said some of this technology would have been getting used in the past, but not by them. Who would have been using that technology?
Well, that's a fantastic question. We went to some places and saw some murals, and these were in ruins of monasteries. They were not current monasteries. They were past monasteries. They've been in ruins probably for 3 centuries. And the murals that were on the wall showed not Tibetans, but blue-eyed, white-skinned, long-haired beings with enormous foreheads, like the forehead in Green Lantern, that kind of
almost forehead. Like an elongated skull?
Like an elongated skull?
Very elongated, but not in the back. In the front, the frontal lobe was just huge, and they were levitating in these murals. So I think that there were higher beings around at that time, and they were using advanced technologies, and the ordinary humans on the earth saw them use the technology and just tried to duplicate it.
I definitely don't.
Sorry, Joe. I see you stood there in your picture in front of the pyramids. It's always a place I've felt drawn to for whatever kind of reason. I do not know. Now, I kind of have not a theory, but an idea that possibly Stargate kind of travel would have been accessible through them back in the day when they were at their prime and their glory, coated in marble and capstone on. Do you think there could be something to that as well?
Well, there are several fascinating things about the pyramids, and I have spent many days inside the pyramids. The workmanship is certainly stunning. But when you think of the engineering and the management that it took to have a stone cut 1,000 miles away in Sudan and delivered to that spot to fit, we have email, we have AutoCAD today, and we cannot order parts that are delivered and fit to that quality. They didn't have any such thing. They didn't even have a standard measurement system or the wheel back then, so I don't know how they did it. But be that as it may, as fine a workmanship as you find on that building, it's not nearly as stunning to me as the alignment of that building within 2 arc seconds of Sirius. And it's been that way for 11,000 years. That blows my mind.
Wow.
Wow. Did they not say that it took 20 years to build the Great Pyramid?
There is some controversy as to how much time it took. There's about a little more than 1.4 million blocks that it took to build that complex.
Yeah.
It is said that they would have to have cut something like 5 to 6 stones a day, every day, to build in that frame of time. And the red granite was transported from Aswan, which is 300 miles in one direction, and the black granite in Sudan, 1,000 miles in the other direction. No roads, no trees to cut down and make, barges or flotation devices or rollers for the roads, which certainly would have been just crunched to pieces after a few blocks.
Let me ask you this: was the climate different then, though? I mean, was it more of a lush environment by the pyramids during that time? Or in that area?
Nile even actually flowed underneath it in some of the models I've seen, Joe.
Yeah.
Well, I like the way you say the word then, because there's some controversy over when they were built. Now, Egyptians will tell you that they built them. But dating of the complex is somewhere between 11,000 and 13,000 years ago, which is well before Egypt was even Egypt.
Right, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Many people say that was a lush and tropical area right up to the edge of the Sahara, but more ancient than that, probably more like 20 to 25,000 years ago. I don't really know what it looked like 11 to 13,000 years ago, but it's clear that there was some cataclysmic event that changed the climate in that area.
No, I agree. There's also, I think there was evidence of water underneath the pyramids. And
Water under the pyramids,
yeah, what was it that I was looking at?
Christopher Dunn.
Osiris's tomb. When they found Osiris's tomb, the way that it was set up to look just like a Stargate. Like they put him right in a Stargate fashion, and it just kind of rings a bell to me when you talked about the Tibetan thing and how they, when the monks die, they intern him in the that 100 whatever it was, that big 40-foot gold statue. The stucca, right? But it very much similar circumstances with the tomb of Osiris, and
you're talking about the complex underneath Abydos.
Yes.
Well, I mean that's an interesting complex. When both times I've been there 4 times, and all 4 times it was submerged in water because there's a spring there. But it's clear enough that you can see that the base of it is really curious. Not only is it red granite, almost identical to what the pyramids are built out of, it's a long way from Cairo. It's probably a 2-hour bus ride through several government checkpoints to get to Abydos. Abydos was built long after the Osirian was built, probably 10,000 years later. The Osirian was buried in the desert. It was lost. Modern pharaohs had no idea what this thing was. So they sent their engineers out looking for it because they knew it should exist. And when they found it in the sand, they partially exhumed it, and then they came and built the Temple of Abydos on top of it. So the 2 complexes are much different dates. But as I said, it's flooded, and there are guards everywhere, and I could not, even though I hiked up my pants, I could not get in the water and walk back underneath the complex. They just wouldn't let us do it.
Wow.
I tried, but they threatened to leave me there under the sand. I didn't do it.
Dr. Agnew, sorry to drag you all over Egypt here, but going back to the pyramids, I'm just interested to know whether you actually tried to conduct any scientific experiments while there, i.e. picking up on the fact that it's rumoured there's even some kind of torsion field that surrounds the top of these structures.
We took a couple pieces of technology with us, but there was only so much we could get through the airport. We brought a what we call a small Tesla coil. It was motor driven, so we could drive up the field. But we didn't get any strange results in the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, and I did manage to get down into the pit. And many people don't get to go there because it's kind of grueling to get there. But you have to squat like walking on your feet, but with your rear end about 2 inches off the floor. And then it's quite steep to walk down this shaft to get to the pit. Now, the pit's probably 90 feet underneath the base of the pyramid. It is blistering hot down there, like no ventilation whatsoever. And you could see that it's very primitive, like they were clawing away with tools to take it further, but they didn't get there. They just quit. I don't know if it was just too much. But here's the neat thing. There's no soot on the walls. Nowhere.
Wow.
Any torches at all in any of these buildings. There's all white, like alabaster, mica to get down in there. But they don't burn anything for light down there. So either they
with the Baghdad battery, that hieroglyph where it almost looks identical to a light bulb. Is that the kind of technology they would have used?
Yeah, it could be. Like you're talking about the chamber under Dendera, which is not many people get to go there either because you got to go through kind of like a hatch in the floor. There's no steps down to it. If you have an exceeding amount of girth, you're not getting in there. That's why there's so few pictures of it out there on the internet. And it's only about 6 feet wide, so you can't get far enough away from the wall to take a picture of it unless you have a wide-angle lens, and most people don't think ahead to take a wide-angle lens. So my second time there, I took a wide-angle lens, and I got some good shots of it, but that's great limitations. However, it's super clear that they were storing electricity, and they were using some kind of either incandescent or bioluminescent light to use to illuminate their work while they carved and painted in those subterranean chambers.
So would you say that there was more of, is there more evidence to support that there was use of like free energy or 0-point energy technology back then?
I didn't see any of that. 0 point is kind of a buzzword in the energy world. It means the point at which in the universe you're at absolute zero, supposedly zero electron movement. It's quite cold, minus 273 Kelvin. But even at that temperature, the reason that is so unique and it's so exciting is that there are energetic particles that pop into existence and then leave again. So it's virtually impossible to create void in space. There's always energy that enters and leaves that spot. It is a minute amount of energy. It is measurable. And I will say that to light an ordinary light bulb, it would take an antenna about half the size of New Mexico. But it is there. And
so does that come from the dark matter, or is this just something else?
That's a really good supposition. I was speaking to Dr. Fred Robb, who runs the, this is going to be a long name, so just bear with me. It's the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. There are two of them. One's in Hanford, Washington, and the other's in Livingston, Louisiana. I've been to both of them. I spent some time with the directors of both of them. I know how they work. I know why they were designed by Dr. Kip Thorne. And the interesting thing is when we drove past what the tourists will talk about when they go see this, he admitted to me, in fact, he openly said, we are measuring particles entering our dimension and leaving our dimension, and we're measuring them in large quantities. Not a lot of energy, but the interesting thing is, as sophisticated as that observatory is, it can only look at about 4.5% of what we call the universe. The rest of it is invisible to us.
So, yeah, now when you talk about that, Doc, you're talking about interdimensional, right? Like when you talk about particles popping in and out of existence, would you say they're going in and out of our existence in 3 space, but it's going somewhere else, right?
Well,
moving between dimensions, I guess you could say.
This is a really good segue because, and it does lead to 0 point, but it also sort of leads into why they built CERN as powerful as they did.
Oh, yeah. Well, hold that thought, because, see, we got about 45 seconds to the break, and it would do you a grave disservice to
Oh,
ramrod you right into the break like that.
It can't be done in 45 seconds. So.
No, so
Anyway, you're almost there. Dimensions are a little bit of a trap to kind of quicksand and semantics, but we'll get to it after the break.
yeah, my wife has been studying this exact topic now for weeks. You can hear her. She's like, "Wow, this is gonna be great." So get ready, folks, because when we come back, it's Woo-a-Palooza here on Transatlantic Truth, 3 hours.
You're listening to the Truth Frequency Radio Network.
No hate, no hype, no fear.
You're listening to the Freedom Link, hour number 2 of our 3-hour Transatlantic Truth every Friday night. Something I look forward to every Friday. And boy, I tell you, it's so good to have you on to talk about these subjects, Dr. Agnew, because like I said before the break, we get so tied up sometimes in all the politics and all the crap, and we never get into the good intellectual stuff. We don't get into the ancient technology and all the things that, gosh, we've been down this road before, it seems, humans. And we were talking about, stargates, interdimensional things, and, particles popping in and out of existence, and that's kind of where we left it off. And I want to leave it with you because, boy, I've never seen my wife so excited for a radio show.
Well, the scientific community that has been observing the universe, and this goes all the way back probably to the 14th century, we've been making observations of not just stars and planets, but other galaxies. We've noticed that galaxies revolve around galaxies, and galaxies form superclusters of galaxies, and those are revolving. But we can notice the universe just based on the light that can enter our telescopes, and maybe through radio waves that we pick up with various antenna telescopes. But what's missing is the mass that it really takes to make these galaxies revolve around one another and stay in shape. And what it inferred to us is that there's a lot more mass than what we can actually detect. And that's where the term dark matter and even dark energy, some of the frequencies that we see fluorescing. And I mean, when we say fluorescing, we mean one particle excites another particle, and it's the second particle that we can see. We can't see the first one, but we can see the second one, and we realize that something made that particle fluoresce. So by its end effect, we can tell that it exists. And so some assumptions were made that seem to be, pretty acceptable, and that is that we can really only see about 4 to maybe 5% of the universe, and the rest of it is unseeable by us, unknowable by us. And if you look at this as just pure physics, it becomes so much blah, 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 blah. But when you combine it with metaphysics, you get an interesting viewpoint of the universe. And that is that most of the universe, the vast majority, way over 90% of the universe, is in chaos. That is to say, it is energy at all kinds of frequencies and all kinds of mass based on, or indicated by what we know as, let's just call it voltage. That's easy for everybody to understand. Mm-hmm. You have high voltage particles and you have low voltage particles. However, only when those frequencies actually resonate with one another, that is to say, they constructively interfere with each other, they tend to form 2 and only 2 kinds of particles. They form protons and they form electrons. We're not exactly sure why, but we know as far as we have looked at all the universe, and we can receive information consistently from about 25,000 light years out, just in our general neighborhood. Those are the only 2 kinds of particles that exist. Everything else is very flitting. They exist for a few billionths of a second and they're gone. Partial resonations, not enough to stay corporal. And in our periodic chart, every single element on there is made of those two particles, protons and electrons. The very most basic one is hydrogen. It's made of one proton and one electron. It is the most massive, the most pure proton in the periodic table. We learned that we theorized that we could actually push two protons together, physically crunch them together, and make them bond. We call it fission. We call it fusion. We fuse two protons together. And when you go from one proton to two protons, you've just changed hydrogen into helium. However, we know that a helium proton loses a little bit of mass. The two helium protons are somewhat lighter than the hydrogen proton. Now, when you take that mass and you multiply it times the speed of light squared, that's a lot of energy, just from two little protons coming together. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's enough energy to force two more protons to come together, and it creates a chain reaction. And that's what we know as a fusion explosion. And of course, we just had to try it. We just had to drop it on somebody. And there's been a few thousand explosions since then. And that's the extent of our use of fusion in the modern day. But here's the metaphysical part of it. We realize that those random frequencies come together in some kind of perfect ratio to form that proton. And the best way we know to figure out how something is made is to break it. So we make a super collider. And a super collider basically takes the little tiny proton, that's the hydrogen proton, that's sitting there at a base charge of 1 electron volt, just 1 volt, and we pump it up with power, with energy, until it's somewhere around 8 teravolts. That is a measure of mass. So we take these little protons and we accelerate them to 99.9% the speed of light. Mm-hmm. We pump up their mass to about 1 teravolt in little packets, and then we split the packet up electromagnetically and run them around a racetrack that's in the shape of a figure 8. And I don't know if you've ever been to a figure 8 race with school buses, but you know what happens when neither driver lets off the gas.
Oh, yeah.
Middle of the figure 8. Well, the same thing happens here, except that these protons are moving very fast and they're extremely massive. They're billions of times, actually trillions of billions of times bigger than they would be at their rest state.
Because if we were actually to try and travel at the speed of light ourselves, Dr. Agnew, it wouldn't be possible by Einstein's model of physics, would it not? Because our mass would become too great to travel at that speed.
And that's exactly right. The standard model, which is a matrix, if you've ever done high school mathematics, you know what a matrix is. The standard model drives us to believe that as you approach the speed of light, the other variable, which is mass in the equation, approaches infinity. And it's asymptotic. That is to say, you cannot push it all the way to infinity. It's just not an achievable number. It's sort of a half of a half, a half of a half. And you get extremely close, but you never actually quite cross the line. And what happens is the amount of energy it takes to make the next notch up in volume is just not attainable. So that's why we can only get to about 99.9% the speed of light with these protons. But be that as it may, we slam these massive protons together, and guess what? They do exactly the same thing those school buses do. They fly in a gazillion different pieces, only the pieces aren't physical. They're frequencies. They're just sounds, basically. And we put spectrometers all around this. We call it an array. And the array picks up the frequencies like sort of like hitting all the piano keys, and the array can tell which keys you actually hit by separating out the frequencies. So none of them are really physical. None of them are really what you would call a piece of glass or a grain of sand. But we know that there's a duality in our physics. We call it wave-particle duality, that waves can actually turn into particles. Photons of light can either act like a particle or they can act like a wave. It depends on how they're observed. So the way we are observing the frequencies coming out of the CERN super collider, we're only seeing waves. But we're making an inference, an assumption that each one of these could actually be observed as a particle. And one in particular has a kind of creative quality about it. That is to say, it should only have about 1 tera electron volt of charge, but it seems to indicate about 8 times that much, about 8 tera electron volts. It's sort of like the frequency that draws the other frequencies together. And years ago, there was a scientist whose name was Higgs, and Higgs pondered on the idea of the black hole. Everybody knows that we have an idea that somewhere out there enough mass gets together and it implodes on itself down to a single point, and we call that a black hole. And there are supermassive spinning black holes, which we can talk about later. But at one point, it became the natural conclusion from this that the entire universe at one time was one big black hole. And if that's the assumption, how in the world, and this is what Higgs pondered, how in the world did it ever get enough energy to explode and create the universe? And what Higgs decided is that somewhere in the process of crunching up the universe into a very, very small particle, some of the energies stayed behind, sort of like balling up a ball of Velcro. That's the way one scientist I heard described it. You can't quite get that stuff really small because the loops are hanging on to the strings or to the hooks, loops and hooks, and somewhere in there, there's just one loop and one hook that's just holding out. And Higgs said that somewhere in time, that loop and that hook snapped. And when it did, it was enough energy to shatter the black hole, and everything came pouring out into what we call the universe. And because we suspect that this particle has that quality, it's been called the Higgs boson. And they've been looking for it, but it takes many, many, many times the amount of energy than we currently have in the super collider, as powerful as we've made it, in order to get that particle to show up consistently. As I said, the power that is required to get a very, very minute increase in performance is incredible. Is
that why we're going to see the Large Hadron Collider started up again in 2015 at double speed, I believe?
Yeah, I think they're trying to get a tenfold, but wow. It's sort of like if you have a Toyota and you get out one night just to see how fast it'll go, and you realize you get up about 117, 18 miles an hour, and it starts doing what we call creeping. You're pushing your foot all the way to the license plate, and you might get 118, maybe 119, and you're creeping. It would take so much more horsepower to get another 10 miles per hour out of it that it would cost you perhaps $10,000 to get another 5 or 6 miles per hour out of it. That's the same thing with CERN. They're at the point now where the pedal's to the metal. They're using superconducting magnets, which means they're pouring liquid nitrogen into this thing to make ceramics operate like magnets. They make the p orbitals in the ceramics stand up in parallel, and it creates a superconducting magnet, almost no resistance. But they have to chill it to 87 degrees below zero to make it do that. So it's very expensive to run this puppy.
And what do you make
they
of
could do that in Glasgow then? So they could do that in Glasgow then. It's usually quite cold here. So
very cold here, right enough. It's like the Arctic Circle at times. But what do you make of the fact that the Vatican have such a keen interest in what is going on at CERN at this time, Dr. Agnew?
I think it's one of the most curious things I've ever thought about, that a church would use its influence and its power and I mean confiscatory power, by force, to take technology in every age, as long as that church has been around, since the 3rd century, and to keep it in secret. That is particularly curious to me. And they operate some of the most sophisticated observatories in the world, and they don't tell anybody what they find.
And you can also add to that, I mean, something myself and Joe have also spoke about. I mean, it's away from CERN, but you have is it Mount Graham where they have the Lucifer device?
Lucifer device, right?
I mean, the stretch that they had to go to get that actual acronym to work is beyond belief. But why are the Vatican so keen on looking outwards to space? And then just recently you've had the Pope coming out and saying that they would welcome their alien brothers and sisters and actually baptize them. What are they looking for right now, Dr. Agnew?
Well, my suspicion is, and I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that they are looking for an inevitable introduction between the race that is currently dominating the Earth, and I wouldn't say that we're the only intelligent race on this planet, but the race that's currently dominating the planet now, and other races. I think that they are not only sure that there's intelligent life elsewhere, but they may, over the centuries, and even more recently than that, have been communicating with them.
Is this what even some people may call the reptilians? And I know there's going to be people in the chat out there thinking I'm going all David Icke, but I think it's just one label for these other beings that are about at this time.
Well, I think it's safe to say, sure. I mean, reptilians, what's a reptile? You know, as I said, Earth is a very rare place, the only place like it that we know of, 25,000 light years in every direction. We could find bigger planets and smaller planets and maybe some with liquid water on the surface, but to support life on the surface of a planet is very rare. If there is life on other planets close by, they're not living on the surface, they're living inside. And it means that, obviously, in order for their key to survival, that their genetic code is going to have to choose different proteins to make a physical body that can withstand the living conditions of that world. And that may be that their skin doesn't look anything like our skin.
Yeah, do you think that some of these, what you'd call beings or different race, could be something as simple as a bloodline, you know, something within the DNA of a lot of these elites and stuff like that, rather than it being like what they perceive as like alien type? It's actually quite human type, or takes on a human form, but it actually lies within the DNA, and that's why they can act so cruel, you know, and do the things that they do globally and stuff.
I think that's what they want us to believe. That's my own personal opinion. Frankly, I've been next to them. I've been in the same room with them. I've had conversations with some of them, and they're no more superior than the average house cat. I think that there is a privilege that they afford themselves, that they assume for themselves, and there are secret combinations which the world can only suspect, and those secret combinations may require the beneficiary, the initiate, to do things that ruin their heart, ruin their soul.
Well, Dr. Agnew, is there even a possibility with devices like CERN, the potential to open almost stargates? Could they even be trying to bring something into our reality? Well,
I mean, of course, anything's possible, and physicists are all about possibilities. I don't have any evidence to that. I think it's just as easy to bring something bad to this world as it is something good. But I look at history, and what I see is that we haven't done a very good job of either in the last, at least in the last 2,000 years. And from what I can see, the leadership of the world has, for more or less economic reasons alone, been at war.
You're absolutely right. Now, here's a question for you. this goes a little bit to another topic, although I kind of connect all this stuff together. But one of the things that my wife and I were looking into was the Bermuda Triangle. Just one of those areas of interest for us. And the more and more research we do, the more and more evidence there is to support that also could be some sort of interdimensional gateway or stargate, if you will. Do you think that that's the case?
Well, I can definitely tell you that the planet Earth, and maybe all planets, but planet Earth certainly has geophysical nodes that have peculiar qualities. And Bermuda Triangle, for its disappearances alone, just in that area, and bright, sunny, cloudless day, airplanes, ships just disappearing. The distance, somebody asked me one time, what is the distance between the two dimensions? And I said, take your index finger and your thumb and press them as hard as you can together. And the space that's between your thumb and finger at that moment is probably 10 times further than the next dimension is away from us.
Wow. That's interesting, yeah.
Just a matter of slipping from one level of consciousness to another. And I think that's, if there is a rapture, I think that's how it'll happen. I think the wicked just become unaware of the righteous, and the righteous become unaware of the wicked, and they just take different worlds on the same planet.
Wow, just kind of cease to exist with one another, huh? Is that what you think?
Well, as I said, we have lots of evidence in Faraday cages, in Casimir experiments, where a significant amount of real physical particles, not just flashes of energy, enter our existence and leave. And there was an argument between Dr. Stephen Hawking and a couple of his colleagues for about 3 decades, actually. And it boiled down to this. Dr. Hawking argued that particles are leaking out of our universe into another universe. And he makes a good argument. He says when particles get close to the rim of the vent horizon of a black hole, that they will clone themselves, and that one of the particles will leave the universe and go into the black hole. And I think he was correct. I read his papers, and I think the theory is correct. But there's more to the story, because I make the observation that there are other universes that may be connected to this universe through those bridges, and that there are particles that are leaving that universe and entering our universe. And the one thing about photons and particles that we know for sure is that really they're information. And that means that information is moving between universes. And this is consistent with Scripture, because we read from at least the early Scriptures that God observed this universe from somewhere else. And that means that there has to be a point somewhere else to observe it. And that observation is the key driving force to make any physical reaction happen. If it's not observed and it's not measured, it quite possibly doesn't happen. So that means that as the consciousness of mankind, and I don't mean just individual people, I mean as a group, combines with the consciousness of a planet, that perhaps these portals are closer than we think. And perhaps maybe it's us that have trapped ourselves.
Or been enslaved, Maybe that information exists, but in an area, in a place that is really kept from the majority of humanity. That's when you take a look at the Knights Templar and all of these other organizations through history, Kev, you could see why they would want to repress this if you're looking at trying to control a population,
It's awfully cliche to say it, but knowledge is power, and that's why they try and occult these things, Joe.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. That's true. It's sort of like you don't want to tell the masses this, because if they know where this well is, they'll just drink all the water up. And if you're going to have power, then that means there has to be potential. There has to be a difference between those who have and those who do not. And so you have to maintain a population of not-haves in order to have that power. If everybody's in your club, what's the point of having a club?
Right.
Do you think these elites are knowingly working for other beings, or are they being manipulated as well?
I think that's the most marvelous question. Because one thing is clear, I mean really clear, when you look at the ancient history and the generations that it took to accomplish some of these projects, those projects didn't vary 1 millimeter from father to son to grandson to uncle to friend. And that's just not possible. Every single generation is going to have an idea, an improvement, a change in direction, unless the leader of that project, the architect of that project, is ancient and doesn't die and hangs around and runs the project from generation to generation so that it continues on course exactly as planned for 2, 3, even 4,000 years.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. Dr. Agnew, I couldn't agree with you more. And if anybody is a good example of that, just look at David Rockefeller. That guy just won't die.
Henry Kissinger as well.
Henry Kissinger too. I mean, they're just they're just gelatinous masses at this point. But anyway, hour number 1's done. Hour number 2's on the way. Hour number 3 of Transatlantic Truth, right here on the Freedom Link, Truth Frequency Radio, truthfrequencyradio.com. Here with Kev Baker and Marty and John Sinclair and Dr. Brooks Agnew and Kenneth Webb. What a night to talk about some off-topic subjects that really need to be talked about a lot more.
Truth Frequency Radio. The wicked one, obviously under heavy Masonic influence. Fighting for humanity and against globalism. One mind at a time. It's the Freedom Link with Joe Joseph.
It's hour number 2 of the Freedom Link right here on Truth Frequency Radio, truthfrequencyradio.com. I'm Joe Joseph, along with Kev Baker, Johnny Sinclair, Marty, Ken Webb, and Dr. Brooks Agnew. And we're just having a fantastic Transatlantic Truth time tonight. Kev, this has been I've been waiting for this one, I'll tell you that.
I've been waiting all week, but this has surpassed every single expectation I could ever have had about tonight. It really has. Dr. Agnew, I just have to thank you for that past hour alone. Oh, amazing information.
Well, it's been my pleasure, absolutely. I like talking about this stuff. Don't get to speak about it a lot with a lot of people, but being with intelligent people that know how to ask questions and explore, that's just I just want to sit and play darts and throw back a few pints and have more conversation.
Yeah, no, for real. Now I got something for you, because this kind of ties into some of the other research that you've done recently, in the past 10, 15 years, is, how does all of this, how does the frequency of the Earth, how does the Earth play into this, and how did you come about with the, researching hollow Earth? Did physics take you down that road? What actually made you get into hollow Earth?
That's a good question. Somebody handed me a book. I think it was in 2001, maybe a little after 2002, maybe. No, it was in 2001. We'd start writing the Arc of Millions of Years series, and we published the first book in 2004. And we were gathering information and writing almost on a daily basis. And somebody handed me a book about the hollow Earth, and I read it, and I thought, boy, that's really out there. And I set it on the shelf, and I really didn't pay any attention to it. We pushed on. We wrote for 3 more years, and the first book was like pretty close to 1,000 pages, but the publisher said it was too big. So we cut it back to 560 pages. It had almost 200 photographs in it, and it was really the work of our lives. My co-author and I, we put it out, and it was on the the creation and destiny of the earth, and took us up to probably about the flood of Noah. And I thought, you buy 5 copies, I'll buy 5 copies, and we'll call ourselves writers, and, at least we've done it. Well, 3 months later, it was an Amazon bestseller, and we made some money. First time in my life that I've made a lot of money writing. And I've written, hundreds of articles and magazine articles and things like that before that, but never a book. Well, we had to take the last 400 pages, and we had to write more. So we wrote 3 more volumes, and all of those volumes kind of took off on their own. But somewhere in there, somebody sent me a photograph that was taken by a satellite of Earth, and it showed auroras over both poles at the same time. And I inquired, I said, are you sure this isn't a doctored photograph? Because we all know that the auroras are caused by the solar wind that blows on the Earth, and the particles, come in and form cosmic rays which fluoresce and sputter off particles that emit light. And they said, nope, it's definitely not doctored. There are auroras over both poles at the same time.
Wow. And
NASA had the same aha that I did. This was in, I think 2006. And they decided to build a 5-satellite complex called Themis. I called it Themis at the time, but that's a wrong enunciation. And they launched it, and the purpose of this satellite group, and it was put up kind of hastily too, was to measure the source of the auroras. These satellites were at different altitudes, so they actually traveled around the planet at different speeds, and you had to wait some weeks before they actually lined up, in a line, like a ladder going out into space, and then you could run them. And so they ran the experiment about 4 or 5 months later when the satellites were aligned, and lo and behold, there was an aurora that appeared while the satellites weren't lined up, and there was no solar wind to speak of. It was in the low 300 kilometers per second range, which is why that physical piece of evidence really excited all of us in the community, because if you do a scatter plot between solar wind and auroras, they don't line up. You get a cloud. There's no linear association, which means that the auroras were coming from somewhere else. And what they discovered was that they called it a cosmic bullet at the time, which, believe me, sounds as ridiculous now as it did when their article came out. But they said between satellites 3 and 4, there was an explosion that occurred out of open space, like a interdimensional firecracker that goes off. The shock wave passed satellite 4 and 5 and went out into space. And it passed satellites 3, 2, and 1, and when it struck the Earth, there was the aurora. And that was their paper. And I wrote them, and I said, what graduate student wrote this tripe? This is not legitimate. You can't take one event like this and come to a conclusion. And I railed them on their statistics and their scientific method, which is something we scientists do on one another. If you don't write something correctly, it doesn't have legitimacy, and that didn't. And it really started me thinking about that book again. So I went and I got it off the shelf, and I read it again. And I said, holy crap. Are you inferring that planets might form as hollow spheres instead of molten balls floating through space? And that we don't live on tectonic plates like cornflakes floating around in a liquid bowl of milk? Everybody knows that's true. And I started to do what we call a Benjamin Franklin in business, but I started assessing the evidence for and against the current planetary core geology. Now, this is not my field, but I have good scientific methods, and I gathered the data, and what I came to the conclusion of is there was a great question about this. It wasn't proven one way or the other. There was a hypothesis. There was certainly a theory that could be made from it, but there was no evidence. No experimentation had been done. So I said, all right, I'm going to do some research on this. So I go to the web because it was pretty reliable. I said, I'm going to find an expedition. Somebody has gone up there, sure. And guess what? No one had. In fact, in 2007, the winter of 2007, right before 2008, there was a continent-sized piece of ice that broke off of the Arctic. Oh, the global warming people went crazy. The Northwest Passage was open for the first time in perhaps maybe 20,000 years. And I know this because my ancestor, whose name is Sir James Ross, was the discoverer of the North Magnetic Pole in 1831. And I know this because he almost lost his life twice. Once his ship was crushed between icebergs. They bailed off of the ship with as much supplies as they could get off, and they waited until the ice broke up, which is about 2 months. They stayed on that berg until another ship came and rescued them. And darned if the guy didn't raise enough money and go back and out and do it again. And he found the North Magnetic Pole in 1831. So that's a crazy explorer, to be sure. And I thought to myself, so why am I 3 generations in the future here thinking about this again? And I said, I got to find an expedition. There's got to be an expedition going up there. And sure enough, there was. And it was being run by a man named Stephen Curry, who had a long life of very exotic expeditions and success at it. So I said, I'm going to join the expedition. I'm going to join. I'm going to take some equipment. I'll be a contributing scientist or whatever. I'll join the expedition. And that was in 2005. So I went and met with Stephen that summer of I think it was in this, yeah, it was that summer of 2005. And then again in November, right before 2006. Well, that was the time when, the second Arc of Millions of Years book was coming out, and it was just blazing. So I was asked to speak at a convention up in Washington, and I said, okay, I'll go. And I've never done anything like this before. I never went out and spoke to anybody except scientific communities. But there I was, way up there in Trout Lake, Washington, speaking before 300 people in August of 2006 about the book and various things. And I had an amazing experience. Maybe we'll go into it later, but it's irrelevant to the story at the moment. But the bottom line is that I came home from that really changed. I mean, physically. I dropped 40 pounds in about 35 days. I laid my glasses down for the last time, and I never took another drop of asthma medicine that I had had since I was 5. Wow. And I've never had an attack since. It was a change, let me tell you. And I called up my friends who were with the expedition. This was, I don't know, 4 or 5 days later. And they told me, haven't you heard? I said, heard what? I said, well, Stephen Curry's dead. He had what they call rapid onset brain cancer. And it took him out in like 3 months. I just spoke to the guy. And he was healthy, vibrant, ready to go on the expedition. We'd raised some money and looked like we were going to be successful doing it. And they said, so I guess the expedition's over. I said, wow, that is so tragic. I just can't believe that. I was really looking forward to it. So they called me back and said, listen, we've talked among ourselves and want to know if you would lead the expedition. And I said, well, I mean, I'm a project manager. I've done multi-million-dollar projects before for construction and engineering and, plant management and stuff. I'll try it. So I gave it 7 years. And I just could not seem to raise the $3 million it took to pull this off. So we never went. So all that data that we gathered leaves in question the current view of planetary core geology, and we don't have any conclusive data that there actually is an opening between the surface and the inner Earth. What we do know from the research that's been done from Harvard, from MIT, and from a joint study between Japanese professors and those at Stanford University, that the Earth is in fact somewhat hollow, that the core is a solid crystal of iron at somewhere around 6 million degrees, and that the center of gravity for the Earth is not in the center of the planet. All of these pieces of evidence seem to indicate that there is not only a significant difference between the mass of the crust and the mass of the core, but it also indicates that the two are counter-rotating against one another, which creates our magnetosphere. It throws the entire current model of a molten river that flows in a hourglass kind of formation on the inside of our planet, responsible for our gravitational field and our magnetosphere, and it strongly supports the physical observation that was made of two auroras, one over each pole at the same time.
Wow, that's fantastic. Especially when you consider the fact that, well, at least to me, it seems that science has taken on, in a lot of aspects, more. It's become more dogma in a way than science. It seems like a lot of scientists out there want to cling to these old theories or these old ideas of the way things are, and God forbid you step out of the box, Well,
there's a good reason for that, and I can explain that too. We call it religiosity, but yes, there are high priests of science and all that, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is for universities is money. Universities make some money off of tuition. They get some from, different kinds of grants and foundations. But the vast majority of scientific exploration money, the stuff that pays for the grad students, that buys the equipment, that pays for the supplies, comes from government grants. And these grants are obtained by the professors, and usually the full professors, sometimes the associate professors, but mostly the full professors, writing grant applications and going and making their case before the various agencies. And the favorite one, especially in this science, not only molecular biology, but also cosmology and the physical sciences, the main source is DARPA. Now, you might see something that looks like genetic research or recombinant DNA, or you might see something that looks like laser research for medical purposes or blah, blah, blah. But you follow the papers. You drive past the foundation to the source of the money, and 9 times out of 10, it's DARPA. And that is why they stick to the story.
So would you say that from a standpoint of technology, where would you say we stand, civilian type, to the type of technology that the shadows, the people that lurk in the shadows, if you will, what they possess? I mean, do you think that it's a significant leap forward?
I think that it's a small community that knows what that technology is capable of doing. There seems to be, and this is where it gets back to Kev's question about, do you think that there is, off-worlders, as it were, that are sort of behind the scenes running everything? And this is where it seems to make sense, because I know from history what happens every single time a nation gets its hands on a new bow and arrow. You don't rattle it at your enemy and say, hey, we have this new bow and arrow, so you better do what we say or stop doing that, or we're going to let it loose at you. That's been tried before. It never works. Doomsday machines, all that stuff. None of that ever works. No, we're not scared. We're not scared. Bring it on. But when you demonstrate that, when you go out there and you wipe out 100,000 people in an afternoon, that seems to bring people to the table. And there's only one nation that's ever done that, and that's us. And boy, have we paid for it.
Yeah, tell me about it.
There does, and I'll tell you why. Because we stepped out of line. We got the technology. But then Truman said, hey, let's use it. And that's what we did. We stepped out of line. It's never been used in warfare since. Not because there aren't people stupid enough or crazy enough to do it. Not because the weapons didn't exist. They certainly did. But no one else stepped out of line but us.
Dr. Agnew, is that not what Tesla as well, he was worried about with some of his work, that it would be weaponized?
Well, I think he actually introduced some of his technology as weapons. But here's an interesting quote that came from the movie The Prestige. Do you see that movie?
Awesome film.
Yeah.
Well, Tesla was talking in his exile in Colorado Springs to the character that was played by Hugh Grant. Or not Hugh Grant, but
Hugh Jackman.
Yeah, Hugh Jackson.
Yeah.
He said, if you invent something really great, you are a genius. But if you invent two great things, you're a crackpot. That is what happened to Tesla. He was an idea a minute. In science, and I get this all the time in engineering, because we're into manufacturing electric vehicles, and that's very innovative. I told a couple of the people with the officials in this area, there's a wave in this field of new technology, applying it to vehicles. And if you go to the very top of the wave as it's pushing forward, you'll see this kind of frothy little vapor thing, where right out on the very edge of the wave as the wave's pushing forward. And if you reach out really far, like right to the very end of that foam, that's where we are. So I think that the common person has access to this technology. They can make the connection and apply it in everyday life. And I think Tesla was trying to do that too. But the economic community thinks about the meter. How much am I going to get paid for this technology, and how long am I going to get paid for it? In electronics, we call this the PlayStation effect. PlayStation 1 came out and kids loved it. And when that sales started falling off, they came out with PlayStation 2 and so forth. But they had PlayStation 4 already on the shelf. You don't introduce it until you've made all the money you can make on PlayStation 3.
Right.
That is where society is right now. Most of society says, look, all this moon research, all this blah, 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 how does that benefit me now? How does that get me something free? How does that lower my house payment? How come I can't get a cut of that? And that's the way every single economic magnate in the world thinks. And you couple that with the alchemical idea that somehow the elite in the world believe, and I don't know where they got this belief, because it's the most erroneous thing I've ever heard of in my life. No sane person would believe this. Somehow they believe that the real value in the world is in money. What kind of horse crap is that?
Yeah, tell me.
There's no value in money at all. That's just a system of exchange. The value is on either end of that. The benefit that whatever it is you make, whether it's a cucumber or a set of brakes, and the technology it takes to make that on the front end. Those are the only two things of value. The money in between is a joke. It's an alchemical pile of paper. It's meaningless. And yet somehow the owners of the world have made us focus on how much money we have in the bank.
Exactly.
Have you ever heard of anything so ridiculous in your whole life?
No. But isn't it interesting, though, that it is pivotal to their plan to make sure that that's established everywhere and that people use the right bank, the right money, and as prefaced by our, the American foreign policy. If you look at American foreign policy, all the countries that we've attacked in the 21st century, none of them had a central bank, a Rothschild-controlled central bank. And slowly but surely, we're getting them there,
Well, you don't have to go, you can go a lot further back than that.
Sure.
You can go back to colonial times. We didn't have a central bank, although Hamilton was a proponent for it. And it was Andrew Jackson that stood between those bank charters and the U.S. and was responsible for bringing the wrath of the Rothschilds down on the United States in the form of the War of 1812. And we lost we had to sign the charter, which we did. And the day we did, the war was over.
Absolutely.
S.A. Rothschilds, Joe, they're everywhere.
The stinking Rothschilds and the Rockefellers.
I know you love them so much.
No, that's actually Ken Webb. That's it. That's his hero. But so I don't want to get back. There's so much to talk about with the science. And I'm just
so close to the break as well. So
I know, man. I know.
But Popeye's going to be coming up after our show. He's going to be interviewing John Cameron. He's going to be going into a serial killer. And I urge everyone out there, I know it's getting late here in the UK, but please, please, please stay tuned for that, because that's going to be a really fascinating show tonight.
Yeah. Hey, Doc, we got a couple minutes before we go to the break. We were talking about Hollow Earth. This is a question that always gets, I always get asked, and I kind of don't know how to answer it. But if the model for the Earth isn't the way that, you're taught in textbooks, then where does all the magma come from? Where does that come from?
Well, that's a common question. The crust, if the models are correct, is somewhere between 800 and 900 miles thick. That's a tremendous amount of mass.
Yeah.
Now, that crust is not, stationary by any means. It's undulating. It's moving constantly because of the forces of tidal gravity, not just from the moon, but other celestial bodies out there as well. Plus, there's a little bit of ringing still going on in the Earth. As the Earth has been expanding for some millions of years, it has also been slowing down. But the energy is conserved in the entire planet. So the movement of stone against stone, the pressure of gravity pushing down from the surface and pushing out from the inside, keeps the center of the crust, which could be a couple hundred miles of magma, flowing and currently, gluing the two parts of the crust together. So we've only cut into the Earth about 8 miles. That's it.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, that's fascinating. If it is 800 to 900 miles thick, I could definitely see that then. We're going to break. When we get back, that's also another very interesting topic that Kev Baker likes, is the expanding Earth.
This is Truth Frequency Radio.
No hate, no hype, no fear. Real people, real radio.
Welcome back, everybody. It's the final segment of the Freedom Link, hour number 3 of our Transatlantic Truth Festival, right here on Freaky Friday. We got so many names for this thing, Kev, But I'll tell you, it should be called Fascinating Friday. The hell with Freaky.
I think that we'll have to rebrand it as the...
Yeah, because, I'm just like, whoa. This is all great information. And when we left, we were getting into one of your favorite subjects, expanding Earth.
Yeah, it's always I can't remember where I first actually heard it, but my immediate thought was, when I actually thought about it, and you look at all the continents and things, if you crushed the Earth down in size, everything would kind of fit. And it just seems to make sense that over time maybe expansions have taken place. And I'd like to get your take on that, Dr. Agnew. And also, do these expansions and things, or geological kind of events, do they occur over tens of thousands of years like we're led to believe, or are they more rapid?
Well, two good questions. I think the first time I really got fascinated with, I watched Neil Adams' animation of it, which was just fascinating. The whole thing is about 20 minutes long. It's a 20-minute YouTube, but I've watched it several times, and I've even used portions of it with his permission in presentations. And it would be just so much Walt Disney if there weren't tons of evidence right down there at the bottom of the sea of the crust cracking open and filling in with molten material right on the Discovery Channel. It's still going on. Now, it's slower now, and that answers, I think, your second question. In the beginning, if our thoughts about cosmology and the formation of planets is correct, that first these huge accretion disks form, and they're revolving around each other, and pockets of dust, by actually a Fibonacci ratio of rings around the center, begin to coagulate into planets, and the star coagulates in the center, reaches a gravitational point where it ignites, and you create a solar system. There's plenty of proto-solar systems out there that the telescopes have shown us. And if that's true, then that means that these planets, as they shrink and they spin faster and faster in order to conserve energy, sort of like an ice skater, pulling her arms in, and she goes faster and faster and faster from her original spin. But a funny thing happens to planets, one of three things actually. Either they spin so fast and they crush so hard that they explode and they become like an asteroid belt, or they become lopsided and they spit off a piece of themselves like a moon, and we have evidence of that in our own solar system. Mercury was once a moon of Venus and has now assumed its own orbit, but they were once one planet. And then the third is a zone, I guess you could call Goldilocks, where the planet expands and cools and slows down a little bit, and expands and cools and slows down a little bit. And what happens is the crust actually moves away from the hard core. And the crust, becoming larger and larger in diameter, must balance the equation, and so it must assume a slower velocity, which means the core is rotating much faster than the outer crust. That counter-rotation creates a magnetosphere around that planet, which prevents shortwave ultraviolet radiation from reaching the surface of that planet, and thus allowing life to exist, at least in microbial form, on the surface. And that's the basis by which, planets are geoformed into planets that are a balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen and the other elements. If those conditions don't exist, it also helps to throw in a moon, because that creates tides and allows nutrients to kind of pump around the planet in the oceans. If you don't have those components, you can't have a planet with life. It's pretty rare, because we haven't found another one like it as far as we've seen. But you make the same observation the average 9-year-old could make, in that all the continental shelves fit together perfectly, except they're all pushed apart from one another. So somebody blew up the balloon, allowing the continents to drift apart. And that's about as brilliant. And I had a proctor when I was doing my dissertation, and he said, I don't know where it's written down, but I really like it. He said, simplicity is the crown of genius, complexity the cloak of mediocrity. And this is the simplest explanation for why the continents are distributed the way they are around our planet, and why we have such a powerful magnetosphere that protects us from solar radiation. And if it's that simple, it has to be genius.
Absolutely. Now, Johnny Sinclair, you had a question about the moon. So what a great segue.
Yeah, that worked in absolutely perfect. But what I was thinking is, our moon, it seems too far out to be like a true satellite of Earth. And it seems to be too big to have been captured by the Earth. So, if it's neither a true satellite or a captured one, what is it really? Because it seems too perfect.
Moon capture or Earth capture theory has been around for a long, long time, perhaps since Halley's day. But it has been refuted, just as you have surmised. There's no possible way the Earth could have captured the moon. The evidence of the way the moon rotates, the plane of its arrangement, means it's virtually impossible. However, there's a brilliant, Niels Bohr actually came up with it. It's a theory called complementarity. It means that the opposite of a truth is not necessarily false. It might be another truth. So the opposite of Earth capture theory is moon capture theory. And that is to say the moon was in this orbit and the Earth was the outsider and was captured by the moon. Now, if you look at the rotation of the moon compared to the rotation of the Earth, it fits that theory perfectly, because moons tend to rotate on their axis. Planets, relatively, do not. And
Could something with the moon's mass, though, have an effect on a body the size of the Earth?
Sure, absolutely. Especially if it was, the right kind of entrance. Most cosmologists believe today that the Earth is actually a resident of the Sagittarius galaxy, and that the moon was ejected from the galaxy and gently merged with the Milky Way galaxy on the very outside edge, which is where we are located, and was captured in this orbit by the moon, which would have stopped the moon's rotation. It rotates once every 28 days, and it takes 28 days to go around the Earth. That's why we look at the same side of the moon all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, a lot of people look at the moon, they think it's just a big grey planet up there, but it's behind it's absolutely fantastic. What we wouldn't have here if we didn't have the moon.
I don't think we'd have life on this planet if we.
Our life would be unsustainable, I believe.
Yeah.
On the surface, it would be very difficult because the oceans really are the basis of the food chain, and the oceans pump around the planet because of the tidal gravity of the moon. The way those tides move, up around Alaska or southern Alaska, the tides are about 45 feet. That's a lot of water moving up and down, up and down, up and down. It creates the flow, the pump that moves the plankton and life around the planet and distributes nutrients around the planet. It's essential.
And Dr. Agnew, I just have to ask you, it's one of the hottest topics on the internet since I've ever first come onto the web. Our sun, is it part of a binary system? Is there some second sun out there that we're hearing about? Or even that Nibiru that we're told about?
Oh, you went there.
I
went there.
I remember in the very first hour I mentioned that the pyramid was aligned within 2 arc seconds of the star Sirius.
Yes.
You know and I know that Earth has moved through at least 3 signs of the zodiac in its precession around the flow. The precession of the equinox is about between 23,500 and 26,000 years. So that means about every 2,390 years we move through one of the signs of the zodiac. Right now, Polaris is our North Star. If that's the case, how could the pyramid have been aligned to the star Sirius for 11,000 years? Unless Sirius is the binary star of our own sun.
Wow. And then, of course, that throws into the mix the question of the Dogon tribe, who actually were celebrating Sirius A and Sirius B before we even knew there was a second one up there.
That's a very good observation, because the star we see as Sirius is not the larger of the two, but it's the one that puts off the light. In the
Dr. Agnew, that they even knew the actual orbit time for this second planet, sun.
They also call Earth the 6th planet, not the 3rd, because they count from the outside in.
Oh wow! I never even realized that. That's this is uncharted territory for me, Kev.
Oh, my head is racing here. It's just unbelievable. I think we could do with another 3 hours on top of all this.
Oh, good God Almighty!
But either they had some hellacious campfire talks with off-worlders and carried them forward as their own, or they actually are settlers here or were brought here from outside.
Wow.
Okay, Kev, come on, keep it going.
There's just so many thoughts racing through my head there. Yeah, that could definitely be true, but we were talking at the start how these beings came down and they obviously displayed and used the Tesla technology. And I do believe that that was a similar kind of thing at the pyramids, and possibly I believe that they left that area.
But would you say it would be alien in nature, or would you? I guess alien is anything not of this planet, but or would you call it more interdimensional? See, I don't know. I
think that's two kind of labels for the same thing, Joe.
Do you think so? I mean, Doc, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, a traveler who's actually going through physical space in some kind of can would have a different observation than someone who stepped from behind a veil into this dimension.
Right.
I think that the observation that the Dogons have and the Hopis have displayed is more consistent with the traveler in the can than in the interdimensional being.
So, so they're two different things, is what you're saying?
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, maybe it's possible that ships travel interdimensionally and then travel the rest of the way in order to keep from hitting stuff. But the observation is that, you know, you're going through the blackness of space, and now all of a sudden you see Pluto, and you're going to, you know, come past Neptune and Uranus and come to Earth. That would be your observation. And to be able to pass down that story to your descendants who, for some reason, didn't maintain that level of technology, but very quickly descended into a people that rubs two sticks together to make fire, that's where it kind of leaves the average, you know, Discovery Channel watcher.
And Dr. Agnew, do you think whoever came here, do you think they've seen the potential of us to end up detonating nuclear devices, and that's why they encircled us with the Van Allen radiation belt to keep us in here for a certain time?
Well, I don't know if it's us or if it's the...
to keep them out, maybe.
Well, no, I don't know if it's us or it's the brains behind the path toward the atomic bomb. I have a tendency to think that there are some, more than one, intelligent being here that are many, many thousands of years old and tend to keep those elites so loyal that they will not vary from the plan. Now, I think in times past, maybe they've shown themselves. They've come out and said, hey, you know, I'm all that, and you're going to do what I say. But the thing about very old beings is they don't have a concept that humans breed like rabbits. And, you know, it doesn't take very long before we say, you know what, we're not taking that anymore. And then they come and just beat the whole place to the ground. So they've tried that. It doesn't work. We end up charging across the frozen tundra at each other and just whipping the hell out of each other. So taking a longer path and staying behind the scenes and promising wealth and power, generations of power, to certain family lines, I think has been much more successful for them. Don't you?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it just, as I do the research into this type of thing, you know, I always, physical reality just doesn't hold up anymore to me. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's there, but there's so much more to existence than what we know. Like, the more that we learn...
It's like holographic universes.
Oh, man, yeah, like how the universe is a hologram. I could actually understand that somewhat, you know? Would you say there's some validity to that, Dr. Agnew, that the universe is a hologram in nature?
Well, you remember we were talking about CERN, and we were talking about the difference between a hydrogen proton and a helium proton. Chemically speaking, they're still the same proton. In fact, it was a long time before we really started considering them differently. But the physical fact is that protons change in weight from element to element all the way down to iron. Iron is kind of the base proton. And then they slowly build weight going back up to the higher elements. But chemically, there's still a proton. Now, we've been splattering the niggers apart with CERN, and as I said, there's no glass that flies up against the wall when these things break apart. It's just frequencies, which leads me to believe that the proton and the electron are actually holographic particles. That is to say, there's a I'm going to use a term you probably haven't heard before. There's a term in imaging called stochastic arrangements. It means that if you pick up a high-end magazine and you're looking at the picture of a race car or a beautiful swimsuit model, what you're looking at is actually, if you take a magnifying glass and go down to it, you're looking at dots that are arranged in a grid, different colored dots, and they're arranged close enough that you see the Lamborghini or you see, Scarlett Johansson.
Right.
I do all the time. But anyway,
Oh yeah.
if you get down to the loop, get down to the thousandth of an inch level, they're just dots. But they are stochastically arranged so that it creates an image of the Lamborghini. Now, you can go in there and you can remove a significant number of those dots. If you do it uniformly between the 5 colors that it takes to make that image, it just seems to fade a little bit. But it's still her. It's still the car. If you put them all back in, then the color's nice and rich and you see everything. There's a point at which it no longer is corporal. It's more like, Casper the Ghost. And then it goes away altogether. But there's no clear delineation between here and not here in the holographic world. It's when you reach what is called irreducible complexity, the point at which the whole thing can't stay together. In construction, we used to call it the fifth house. There's an old story that a developer goes to a builder and says, look, I have these plans. I want you to build this house. And every house that you build on the next lot, I want you to remove 1/7 of the lumber. And so the builder did it. And they got to the 6th house, and they had a real problem. So they called the developer and said, look, we did what you said. We've been building the house. We built the first one. Everything was fine. Second, everything fine. But we're to this 6th house, and try as we might, we can't keep it standing up. It keeps falling over. And the developer says, fine, build them all like the 5th house. It's the point of irreducible complexity. When you take out that last 2x4 and the second story collapses onto the first.
I gotcha.
In atomics, we call this the tetrahedron. It's the most basic shape, 4 points connected, not 3, 4, that gives it 3 dimensions. If you take that last one out, you now have a 2-dimensional world, and the whole thing collapses. So you've got to have at least 4 points to start that structure. Same thing with holograms. Holograms are a stochastic arrangement of frequencies or dots or components that make a proton a proton. Once it's a proton, it will chemically exist in this universe forever. If you have a 16-ounce hammer that was handed down to you from your great-grandfather, I guarantee you could still drive a nail with that hammer. Those protons will never, ever go away.
Wow, that's fascinating. Again, this is just like a look at reality that I just haven't ever, really considered before, because it's kind of, Kev, what would you call it?
Deep.
I guess.
I don't think there's words for it.
No, but that's the interesting thing about science is, you don't have to be right. As a matter of fact, very often you don't know the answer. You're just kind of theorizing. But boy,
doesn't
I
make
tell
you
you
feel
what.
alive, Joe, to actually be sitting talking and thinking about this kind of thing. When you look at all the absolute idiocy that surrounds us and the world around us, more of this is what we need.
Oh, absolutely, and lively debate about it too. Because like we said earlier on, it would really be boring and dull if we all agreed about everything, wouldn't it?
Exactly, that's the whole thing. But before Dr. Agnew leaves, I'd love to ask you, Dr. Agnew, I'd love to put you in charge of science for the world. What would be the one thing that you would be wanting to pump the money into right now, as opposed to some of the insane projects that exist?
That's a great question. I would immediately pull all the money from the world's defense programs, and I would put it into space research.
Oh, excellent.
And do you think there is some kind of breakaway civilization or secret space project that we sometimes hear about in the alternative media? Do you think there's some credence to that already?
Well, I know enough people in what used to be Hughes Satellite, and enough people in Anderson, which is a consulting company of experts and policymakers that used to work in NASA and JPL back when in its heyday, to know that there is a lot of information that hasn't been shared with us for, quote, national security reasons. And that's why I would just pull the funding from everybody's defense project. No one would have to defend themselves against anybody. And we would pour $6, $7, maybe $8 trillion a year into space research. Then you would see the community of mankind change.
And
I'd have to agree with you, only because I would think that would kind of pull everybody together.
And also, Joe, free energy to the masses as well down here on Earth.
But that's a free humanity moment. Now you're talking about the control freaks wanting to give that up. Kind of like George Westinghouse. Where do I put a meter on this?
True, very true.
So you would have to break that paradigm, Dr. Agnew. We would have to actually end the cycle of
money
control freaks wreaking havoc.
Yep, the money would have to go away. There's no doubt about it. You would have to get to a society, a method of society, a sociology that was based upon value and satisfaction, but you would also have to avoid what in biology we see in bacteria or rats or anything else. If you supply food and energy to any population, it will immediately begin to replicate itself to the point where it needs to either leave the premises and expand, or it all dies. There are segments of humanity that would multiply unchecked and would ruin the entire thing.
Yeah.
What would have to be done is there would have to be probably a generation of education.
Oh, at least.
Because if you give people free energy and plenty of rice and milk, you won't be able to move. India, China, just look at the places that do spontaneously grow things out of dirt, it seems.
Yeah.
There's no end in sight. There's no constraint whatsoever.
You're right. Well, we're out of time, Dr. Agnew. Coming up next, thanks for stopping by the way. This is great having you on, and what a fantastic night. On 3 hours, Kev, come and gone.
Unbelievable. Thank you so much, Dr. Agnew.
Down the Rabbit Hole with Popeye coming up next. Don't go away, folks.